Hi and welcome to Crash Course Catholicism, a podcast about Catholic teaching and why it makes sense. I'm your host, Caitlin West. Hey friends, welcome to episode 62. So over the next couple of episodes, we are going to be telling the story of Our Lady of Fatima. This is one of the biggest, most incredible and most significant events of the 20th century. And I say that without exaggeration. It is an astonishing story and it has inspired countless conversions over the last 100-odd years. For this episode and for the next one, I've drawn on a number of sources, but the main source that I've used is a book called Our Lady of Fatima by William Thomas Walsh. It's a very recognizable blue book. This book is, in the words of my dad and also of many other people, the definitive work on Our Lady of Fatima because it's based on interviews with the people who witnessed the apparitions, as well as the testimony and writings of Lucia, who was one of the 3 children that Our Lady appeared to. So if you enjoy this episode and the next one and you want to know more, I encourage you to read that book. It is actually very well written and readable. My dad used to read it to us when we were little kids and we loved it, so I highly recommend that. Okay, Our Lady of Fatima. So let's begin with a bit of orientation and background. The events that we're about to discuss took place in Portugal, in a small city called Fátima, in the year 1917. So this is towards the end of World War I, and Portugal had only just recently entered the war. About 1 kilometre outside of Fátima was a tiny little hamlet called Aljustrel, and in this area were living 3 small children, Lucia, Jacinta, and Francisco. Lucia was the eldest. She was 10 years old at the time of the apparitions. She was the youngest of 7 children, and she had a serious and almost sullen appearance. In fact, all 3 of them, when you look at photos of them, they look very serious. However, underneath that serious appearance, Lucia had a big heart. She particularly loved spending time with the younger children. They would often follow her around because she would play with them and she would tell them stories. Lucia was known for her piety from a young age. In fact, she was permitted to receive her first Holy Communion at the age of 6, about 4 years younger than all of the other children, because she was so pious and she had such a deep knowledge of her faith. Lucia had 2 cousins, a brother and sister called Francisco and Jacinta, and they were the youngest of 11 children. Francisco was a year younger than Lucia, so he was 9 at the time of the apparitions. He was quite a solitary, quiet child, and he liked to play by himself, but he was particularly close to his younger sister Jacinta. Jacinta was 7, and she was pretty much the opposite of her brother. She was like a happy little pixie child. She was always running around and playing and dancing. Apparently she absolutely loved to dance. So Jacinta and Francisco adored their older cousin Lucia, and the 3 of them spent as much time as possible playing together. Now, when Lucia was about 8 or 9 years old, she was given the job of shepherding her family's sheep. Now, this was a very common thing for kids in the area to do at the time, but Lucia was a lot younger than the other kids who did that job. And the reason why was that her father wasn't particularly great at looking after the family property. Apparently, he preferred to spend time socializing in the local pub. And often, Lucia's mum, Maria, was left to kind of manage everything at home. Lucia's older sisters were sent out to work to earn money for the family, and because there was no one else to help at home, even though Lucia was very young, she was given the job of being a shepherdess. So every day, Lucia would go out with a few other kids from the local area and they would look after the sheep together. Now, during this time, a few strange incidents happened to Lucia. One day, she and 3 of her friends were saying the rosary together while their sheep were grazing. And suddenly, they saw something white moving through the air and coming towards them. Lucia described the figure as like a statue made of snow. It seemed to have the form of a human being. The figure stopped and stayed suspended in front of them until they finished the rosary, and then it disappeared. Now, this happened another 2 times, and Lucia and her friends had no idea what was happening or why. Some of her friends started telling other people about what they had seen, and so the incident became a kind of topic of gossip in the town. However, most people put it down to children's imaginations, and they didn't really think much of it. Now, ever since Lucia had started looking after the sheep, Jacinta had been begging her mum to let her and Francisco go with Lucia because they hated being parted from her. And eventually, after much begging, her mum was like, okay, yes, you can go. So from then on, all 3 of them, every morning, they would take the sheep together and then they would play games and sing and dance while the sheep were grazing. And then in the afternoon, they would kneel down and say the rosary together. And then they would all take the sheep back home. And that became like their daily routine. Now, I say that the 3 of them would say the rosary together, but these kids were fairly typical children. And like many young children, they found the rosary a little bit boring. So even though they had been instructed to say the rosary every day, they were living in an area where everyone was Catholic, and Catholicism and images of Christianity and songs about Mary and God were very much built into their daily lives. So they said the rosary out of habit, but they invented like a condensed version of the rosary where instead of saying the whole prayers, they would just say the opening 2 words of each prayer. So they would kneel down and say, Our Father, Hail Mary, Hail Mary, Hail Mary, Hail Mary, Hail Mary, glory be. So it wasn't the full rosary. It probably took them like 3 minutes to do the whole thing. And I use this example to highlight the fact that even though, especially Lucia was very pious, they were also very normal children. Okay, so one day, Lucia, Francisco and Jacinta had gone out with the sheep and they were playing some game outside when suddenly it became overcast and it started raining. So the 3 kids ran off to a little cave and they were sort of hanging out there and they had their lunch and they said the rosary. And just as they were finishing the rosary, the rain stopped and the sun came out and they were like, oh, great. So they started to play again. But suddenly, this wind, this really strange, loud wind started blowing through the trees. The trees were like swaying and bending, and the kids looked up and were looking around and they thought that the storm had come back, but the sky was blue and the sun was out and they were like, what the heck's going on? And then, off in the distance, they saw a light moving towards them, and Lucia immediately recognized it as the same figure that she and her friends had seen the year before. And this time, it came way closer to them. It stopped just a couple of meters away from them, and the children could see that the figure was a young man, about 14 or 15 years old. Lucia describes him as being more brilliant than a crystal penetrated by the rays of the sun, and incredibly beautiful. The first thing the young man said to them was, "Don't be afraid." And then he said, "I am the angel of peace. Pray with me." And he prostrated himself on the ground and said the following prayer: "My God, I believe, I adore, I hope, and I love you. I beg pardon of you for those who do not believe, do not adore, do not hope, and do not love you." He said the prayer 3 times, and the children repeated it after him. And then he stood up again and said to them, "Pray thus. The hearts of Jesus and Mary are attentive to the voice of your supplications." And then he disappeared. And the children were left kneeling there, completely dazed. Lucia said that it was so intense that we were almost unaware of our own existence for a long space of time. They remained kneeling and repeating the angel's prayer over and over before eventually recovering and slowly walking home. Lucia warned the other 2 not to say anything to anyone about what they had seen, probably partly because she knew what had happened last time and everyone had gossiped about it, but also because what had happened had felt so sacred that they didn't want to talk about it. Now, interestingly, although all 3 children had seen the angel, Francisco had not been able to hear what the angel was saying. And in fact, throughout all of the apparitions, Francisco never heard what the angel and Our Lady were saying. He could only see them. Now, it isn't exactly clear why this happened. Perhaps Our Lady was teaching Francisco humility, but he always had to rely on what Lucia and Jacinta told him to know what was being said. Now, this angel appeared to the children 2 more times over the next few months. The first time he appeared while they were playing, and he encouraged them to pray a great deal, to offer sacrifices for poor sinners, and to accept the suffering that God would send them. And then the third time, the angel appeared holding a host and a chalice. And after prostrating himself before the host and chalice to pray, the angel placed the host on the tongue of Lucia and offered the chalice to Jacinta and Francisco to drink from. Lucia was the only one who received the host because she was the only one who had made her first Holy Communion. The angel then prayed with the children again before finally disappearing. Now, these apparitions obviously impacted Lucia and Francisco and Jacinta powerfully. Lucia talks about how each time it happened, they would remain in a kind of prayerful ecstasy for a long time afterwards. And it would take them days to recover from what they had seen. Even after time had passed, it kind of felt like everything else around them that had been exciting or attractive or interesting to them before had suddenly become dull and lifeless by comparison with the beauty of what they had seen. It was like they'd been fundamentally rewired and reoriented towards heaven. The three children did their best to follow the angel's advice. They took every opportunity to pray for poor sinners and to offer sacrifices to God. Walsh writes that they would give up little pleasures and satisfactions for the sinners of the world. All three would spend hours at a time lying prostrate on the ground, repeating over and over the prayer that the angel had taught. So obviously something really big has changed inside these children. Now, over the next few months, the angel's prediction that they would experience suffering started to come true, particularly for Lucia. Lucia was having a really hard time at home. Many of her siblings had grown up and gotten married or moved away by this time, leaving her mostly alone at home. Her brother had joined the army, and the whole family was kind of living in fear that he could die at any time. And the few children who remained at home with their mum had to work really, really hard to keep things together. And they also had to witness their mother's loneliness and suffering because their father still spent most of his time socializing at the pub. Lucia's mum eventually became not just depressed, but also really, really physically ill, partly because she was so overworked and overwhelmed. And for a long time, they didn't know what the matter was or if she was going to survive. One of Jacinta and Francisco's brothers had also gone away to war, and at one point the family received a false report that he had died, and so the kids went through this grief of thinking that they'd lost their brother. So they were going through a lot, but the three children always comforted and encouraged each other by remembering what the angel had told them and offering their trials for poor sinners. Now, for about 6 or 7 months after the angel appeared to them, nothing else happened. There were no more apparitions. And then, on the 13th of May, 1917, something extraordinary happened. So the children had taken the sheep out to graze as usual, and they were playing at a place called Cova da Iria, when suddenly they saw a flash of light in the sky that was so intense that they assumed that it was lightning. Thinking that a violent storm was coming, despite the fact that the sky was completely clear and blue, they dropped everything and ran to the shelter of the nearest tree. And then there was a second flash of light, and the children were so frightened that they started to run again. And then suddenly they stopped short, and right in front of them, suspended above a small tree, they saw a lady. Lucia describes her as a lady all of white, more brilliant than the sun, dearer and more intense than a crystal cup full of crystalline water penetrated by the rays of the most glaring sun. Lucia said that this lady was indescribably beautiful, and that her face was not sad, not happy, but serious. Walsh writes that the lady's hands were held together in prayer at her breast, pointing up, with rosary beads hanging down between the fingers of the right hand. Even her garments seemed made solely of the same white light, a simple tunic falling to her feet, and over it a mantle from her head to the same length, its edge made of fiercer light that seemed to glitter like gold. Neither the hair nor the ears could be seen. It was almost impossible to look steadily at the face. It dazzled and hurt the eyes and made one blink or look away. For about 1.5 meters around this lady, there was a pool of radiant light surrounding her. Just like the angel, the first thing that the lady said to the children was, "Don't be afraid. I won't hurt you." She had a voice that was like music, and they felt complete peace and joy as soon as they heard it. Lucia asked the lady where she was from, and she told them that she was from heaven. She told the children that she wanted them to come to this same place on the 13th day of every month for 6 months, and that after that, she would tell them who she was and what she wanted. Lucia asked if she and Jacinta and Francisco would also go to heaven one day, and the lady replied that yes, they would, but that Francisco would first have to say many rosaries. Lucia suddenly remembered that 2 of her friends had died recently, so she asked the lady, "Are my 2 friends in heaven?" The lady said that one of them was, but that the other one would be in purgatory until the end of the world. The lady then asked the children if they were prepared to accept suffering for the conversion of sinners, and the children said yes. She then told them that they would have much to suffer, but that the grace of God would comfort them. And with those words, she opened her hands, and from her palms 2 streams of light poured out and over the children, penetrating right to the core of them. The children dropped to their knees, and they said the following prayer: "O most holy Trinity, I adore you. My God, I love you in the most blessed sacrament." After they had said this prayer, the lady told the children to pray the rosary every day, and then she rose and glided away until she was out of sight. The children were left filled with a sense of peace and joy and freedom that was even greater than what they had felt after the angel appeared to them. On the way home, Lucia once again warned her cousins not to say anything to anyone about what they had seen. But as soon as they got home, Jacinta, who, to be fair, was 7 years old, was so full of joy and excitement that she ran straight to her mum and was like, "Mum, guess what?" and told her all about what they had seen. Jacinta's dad, whose name was Manuel, went and questioned Francisco about what Jacinta was saying, and he became convinced that there was no way these kids could be making up what they were saying because they were using words and terminology and information that they would never have known on their own, and he immediately believed them. He was the first person to believe in these apparitions. Lucia's family, on the other hand, reacted very differently. When the story reached them via Jacinta and Francisco's parents, Lucia's dad kind of laughed it off as nonsense, but her mum was incredibly upset. She was convinced that Lucia was making stuff up, and she did everything that she could to try to make her daughter admit that she was telling a lie. Things got even worse when the story started to spread around the town. People started calling out to the children on the street and teasing them or berating them. And even Lucia's own sisters mocked her and made fun of her. The children were obviously upset by this, but they kept reminding each other of what the lady had told them, and they offered their sufferings for poor sinners. In fact, the 3 children started to do absolutely everything that they could to pray for poor sinners, even to the point of giving their lunch away to the poor every day and not drinking water, even when they were incredibly thirsty and they'd been out in the sun all day. So a month later, on the 13th of June, the children prepared to return to Cova da Iria as the lady had told them to. Now, by this time, people had heard about the apparitions, so when Lucia went to leave the house, she found that there was like a small crowd of people waiting outside to go with her. Word had spread, and people had come not just from their own town, but from miles away. Many people had come by foot to see what was happening, and this small crowd of people followed the children to Cova da Iria. Once they arrived, they found another crowd of about 50-odd people there waiting for them. Now, Lucia was not a fan of this situation, particularly because many of the pilgrims were like pestering her and asking her questions, but she didn't really feel like there was anything that she could do. So, after eating their lunch, the whole group knelt down and prayed the rosary together. And just as they were finishing the rosary, Lucia called out that she could see the light in the distance. Now, I'm going to read the testimony of one of the witnesses who was in that crowd of people. This is what she says. Lucia raised her hands as if in prayer, and I heard her say, "Your Excellency told me to come here. Please say what you want of me." Then we began to hear something, like a very faint voice, but we could not understand what it was saying. It was like the buzzing of a bee. In the testimonies of other onlookers, some people said that the light of the sun seemed to grow dimmer, even though the sky was clear. And other people said that the little tree that the children were kneeling in front of started to bend slightly as if it were under a weight. Now, according to Lucia, the lady repeated her instructions to the children to come to the same place on the 13th day of each month and told them to recite 5 decades of the rosary every day. Lucia then asked the lady if she could please take all 3 of them to heaven, and the lady said, "Yes, Jacinta and Francisco I will take soon, but you remain here for some time more. Jesus wishes to make use of you to have me acknowledged and loved. He wishes to establish in the world the devotion to my Immaculate Heart." Now, Lucia was understandably a bit crestfallen, and she asked the lady if she was going to be left there all alone. And the lady replied, "No, daughter. And do you suffer a great deal? Don't be discouraged. I will never forsake you. My Immaculate Heart will be your refuge and the road that will conduct you to God." And then again, as she said those words, the lady opened her hands and the same light poured out from her palms and enveloped the children. And in this light, the children saw a vision. Lucia writes that they saw, before the palm of the right hand of Our Lady, a heart encircled by thorns which seemed to have pierced it like nails. We understood that it was the Immaculate Heart of Mary, outraged by the sins of humanity for which there must be reparation. Eventually, the vision faded, and the lady rose from the little tree and glided away until she was lost in the distance. Some of the bystanders noticed that at this moment, the leaves at the top of the shrub were like dragged towards the east, as though the lady's garments had trailed across them, and it took them hours to return to their original position. Now, obviously, none of the onlookers had seen the lady herself, but they'd seen enough to know that something had happened, something supernatural, and the crowd was incredibly excited. They followed the children home and they bombarded them with questions, but the children just kept saying that it was a secret and they couldn't share what they'd heard. Apparently, Our Lady didn't actually tell them at this point that they needed to keep everything a secret, but they just had this instinct that they didn't want to share what they had seen willy-nilly, which makes a lot of sense. So most of the people who had been in the crowd on that day were convinced that something supernatural was happening, and they continued to spread the word about the apparitions. Francisco and Jacinta's parents were supportive of them, particularly their dad Manuel, who was convinced that they were telling the truth. Lucia's mother, on the other hand, was still appalled at the situation, and in an attempt to put an end to it, she marched Lucia off to be interrogated by the local priest. The priest questioned Lucia at some length, but he wasn't able to make up his mind about what was happening. At one point, he made the comment that they needed to be very careful because the apparitions could be a deception from the devil. Now, this was not an unreasonable thing to caution against, because the devil has been known to imitate our Lord and Our Lady in order to deceive people. In this case, the fact that the lady was pretty much exclusively asking the children to pray the rosary made it less likely that it was actually coming from some evil source. But in any case, Lucia was struck by this comment because it had never occurred to her before that the apparitions might not be from heaven, and she was horrified. For Lucia's mum, this comment about the devil added fuel to her fire. She became even more upset about the apparitions, and from that time onwards, she would often berate her daughter and even physically strike her in her anger. Lucia, in her turn, was really disturbed by what the priest had said, and she would lie awake every night, tortured by the fear that she had unwittingly been an instrument of the devil. Eventually, she became so upset and exhausted by her sleepless nights that she told Francisco and Jacinta that she was not going to go back to Cova de Iria again. She maintained this position stubbornly for many days, despite Francisco and Jacinta trying to convince her. The night before the next apparition, Francisco and Jacinta stayed up all night praying for Lucia. And then the next morning, Lucia ran to their house and told them that she had changed her mind, and the 3 of them set off to go to Cova de Iria. Okay, so remember how we said in the last apparition that there was like a small crowd of people who came to watch? Well, this time it was only 1 month later, but now the crowd had grown from like 100 people to around 2,000 or 3,000 people. Some of them were pilgrims who had come to ask favors from Our Lady, but many people were there because they were curious or even skeptical. So on that day, the 13th of July, the children arrived with this huge crowd of onlookers at Cova de Iria. They knelt on the ground and they started to say the rosary. And suddenly, Lucia called out, "Take off your hats, for I see Our Lady already." Now, one of the people in the crowd on this particular day was Manuel, Jacinta and Francisco's dad. Now, this is his testimony. He says that he saw something like a small cloud descend upon the little tree. And as the sunlight became dimmer, he heard something that sounded to him like a horsefly in an empty water pot, but he couldn't distinguish any words. Now, according to Lucia, the lady asked the children to come again the next month and to say 5 decades of the rosary every day. She then promised them that in October, so in 3 months' time, she would perform a miracle so that everyone might believe that she was really appearing to them. She encouraged the children to offer sacrifices for poor sinners, and as she spoke, she again opened her hands and light poured over the children. This time, however, the light also passed into the ground in front of them and revealed a vision to them. Now, this is Lucia's description of what they saw. She said that they saw a sea of fire, and plunged in this fire the demons and the souls as if they were red-hot coals, transparent and black or bronze-coloured with human forms, which floated about in the conflagration, borne by the flames which issued from it with clouds of smoke, falling on all sides as sparks fall in great conflagrations, among shrieks and groans of sorrow and despair, which horrify and cause to shudder with fear. The devils were distinguished by horrible and loathsome forms of animals, frightful and unknown, but transparent like black coals that have turned red hot. Now, the children were understandably so terrified by this vision that they felt like they would have died if the lady had not already told them that they were going to go to heaven. The lady then said to them, "You see hell, where the souls of poor sinners go. To save them, God wishes to establish in the world the devotion to my Immaculate Heart. If they do what I will tell you, many souls will be saved and there will be peace. The war is going to end, but if they do not stop offending God, another and worse one will begin in the reign of Pius XI. The lady said if people did not stop offending God, the world would experience a period of war, of hunger, and of persecution of the Church and of the Holy Father. To prevent this, she asked that Russia be consecrated to her Immaculate Heart. The lady said that if her requests were listened to, Russia would be converted and there would be peace. But if not, Russia would scatter her errors throughout the world, provoking wars and persecutions of the Church. The good will be martyred. The Holy Father will have much to suffer. Various nations will be annihilated. In the end, my Immaculate Heart will triumph." The lady told them not to share what they had heard with anyone yet. She then told them a final secret, which actually remained a secret all the way up until the 1960s, and it wasn't officially published by the Church until the year 2000. Lucia never shared this secret until she felt that Our Lady had given her permission. The third secret included a vision of the Holy Father passing through a ruined city, afflicted with pain and sorrow, praying for the souls of the dead, reaching the top of the mountain and then being killed by soldiers, along with many other bishops, priests, religious and lay people. In the vision, they saw 2 angels gathering up the blood of the martyrs and sprinkling it over the souls who were making their way to God. So some pretty intense stuff in these visions. Now, there has been a lot of speculation about what these visions and secrets might have meant, and we won't go into all of that here. But one thing that's worth mentioning is that Pope Benedict XVI said in 2010 that these visions didn't necessarily refer to one single event, but had permanent and ongoing significance. In other words, they referred broadly to the persecution and suffering that the Church would go through at many different times and in many different ways. Now, during this apparition, the lady taught the children a prayer that they should say after each decade of the Rosary. This is the prayer that we referred to in our last episode as the Fatima prayer, so I'll include a copy of that in the show notes of this episode. After showing these visions to the children, the lady passed away into the east once again. Now, almost immediately, this giant crowd of thousands of people began pressing in on the 3 children. They were so excited. They were bombarding them with questions. Now, Manuel, the dad, he could see that they were being crushed. So he got in there and scooped up Jacinta and got the kids and fought his way through the crowd and got them out. Now, at this point, people could see that something extraordinary was happening. And the story started to spread like wildfire throughout Portugal. Newspapers started writing about the apparitions. People were writing think think pieces. Everyone was discussing whether or not it was real. There was also a lot of backlash and anti-Catholic sentiment that came out at this time. Many people speculated that there was some kind of medical or psychological explanation for what was going on. Crowds of pilgrims and believers and skeptics started arriving from all over Portugal, and they would rock up at the homes of the children and ask them questions or beg for favors from Our Lady. The children were understandably quite distressed and overwhelmed by this, and they often wished that they could just be left in peace. And this is an important point to bear in mind, by the way, that these 3 kids had pretty much no reason to keep this story up if it wasn't true, because it's not like they were basking in the happy glow of everyone's attention, like they were fun celebrities. No, they were really suffering. This was an awful time. People were constantly following them around and interrogating them and making fun of them and pestering them. Apparently, theologians and priests would randomly turn up at their homes and start interrogating them and questioning them. Many times the children were in tears of pain and frustration. Lucia's family were